Eight of the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I would look to add on the waiver wire this week. The first guy, Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. So the Giants had an impressive blowout victory in Week 7 versus the Carolina Panthers, 25-3, and Daniel Jones in that one, 203 passing yards, a touchdown, 28 rushing yards, and even caught a pass for 16 yards in that game. So right here, Week 8, he's got a good matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs that we saw just get torched by Ryan Tannehill and the Tennessee Titans offense. And this Chief team gives up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So that's a Monday night game next week in Week 8 here for Daniel Jones and the Giants. And Daniel Jones, he's had 5 good fantasy days, bad games. Week 5 at Dallas, where he left in the first half with a concussion. And Week 6 versus the Rams, he just couldn't do anything versus that great defense. So right here, had a good game in Week 7 versus a mediocre Panther defense. And right here in Week 8 at Kansas City, it's going to be a lot of passing for him, in my opinion. After the Chiefs got embarrassed in that ball game in Week 7, they're going to get off to a hot start, I think, versus this Giant team. And Daniel Jones and the Giants will have to throw a lot. So I think he could have a decent game. And let's be honest, the Chiefs really just can't stop anybody at the quarterback position on the defensive end. So Jones is definitely a guy worth adding this week, and he's available in 75% of fantasy leagues. The next quarterback's Deshaun Watson of the Houston Texans. So the rumors are heating up and picking up quickly right now with a couple teams involved in Watson. Miami and now the Carolina Panthers have jumped in the mix after we saw Sam Darnold get benched in Week 7 for P.J. Walker in that ball game versus the New York Giants midway through. So Sam Darnold got off to an amazing start the first 3 weeks of the season, but that was versus weak teams. So right here, Carolina will be a great fit, in my opinion, for Deshaun Watson if he decides to waive his no-trade clause and go over there, because obviously they got Christian McCaffrey when he comes back and 2 very good receivers that fits the game that Deshaun Watson plays, and DJ Moore, obviously, and Robbie Anderson, who this year's had a down year with Sam Darnold. So right here, Deshaun Watson, I think we're going to see him traded before the November 2nd NFL trade deadline. And that's already next week here. So right here, the talks are picking up. Texans, they're 1-6. They're going nowhere. And they might as well try to get at least a little bit of something in a deal for Watson. So right here, if you're desperate at quarterback or you got room on your bench to take a flyer on for Watson, why not? Because we know he's a great talent. No doubt about it. And hopefully his off-the-field issues are ironed out. The next quarterback I would add this week's Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. So 2 of the last couple games here since he returned. I know it's been versus weak defenses, but he's gone out there and he's performed. Week 6 at Jacksonville in London, 329 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception, and 3 rushes for 22 yards. And Week 7 in a tough loss at the buzzer over there on a field goal, 291 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 windows, and 30 yards rushing. So right now, Tua, he's hanging in there. His team's competing, even though I know they're 1-6 on the season. But the last 2 games they lost since he returned from injury. It's been close games, and he's put up huge fantasy numbers. No doubt about it is Tua here. So Week 8, I know it's a very tough matchup at the Buffalo Bills that give up the least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But right here, with a lot of buys, with injuries, and 2 quarterback leagues, if you're in a pinch, I don't think it's the worst ad in the world. And obviously, he adds a few points. We're rushing the football as well is Tua. So right here, he's still available in 52% of fantasy leagues. And he's a guy to keep in mind and look to add this week. The next quarterback's Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks. So Geno Smith so far, the first couple starts haven't been great for him here with this team. But right here in Week 8, it's a great matchup for Geno versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. And that most likely will be his last start until Russell Wilson returns, even though there's mixed reports about when Wilson returned here. But they got the bye in Week 9. But anyway, in Week 8 here, versus a weak Jacksonville Jaguar defense, I think Geno Smith in deeper leagues and 2 quarterback leagues could be a decent option at quarterback for your fantasy team here. He's still got great weapons in DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, serviceable running backs in Alex Collins and Rashad Penny, and a decent tight end in Gerald Everett. So I think Geno could have a decent game versus Jacksonville in Week 8. And he's available in 95% of fantasy leagues. And the 5th and final quarterback I looked at on the wire this week's Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Lawrence, he was dropped a lot during the bye week at 10%. So now he's available in 60% of fantasy leagues. And his last 3 starts have been pretty solid for him. Week 4 at Cincinnati, 204 yards, 36 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Week 5 versus Tennessee, 273 passing yards, a touchdown, and an into, and also added 28 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown. And Week 6 versus Miami, 319 passing yards, a touchdown, a fumble loss, and 11 rushing yards. So right here, he's starting to turn the ball over less. He's getting more comfortable in Urban Meyer's system, and obviously the NFL here is Trevor Lawrence. And Seattle, they're not the greatest at defenses in the world, and I think he can make some noise in that ball game in Week 8 at Seattle, even though with the 12th man and all that. But I think Trevor Lawrence could be a decent add this week, so that's a few quarterbacks I looked at on the waiver wire for Week 8 of the fantasy football season.